Hi, this is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Wherever you find us, whether it's a video or podcast on your favorite platform, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. You can also find us on major social media platforms. If you go to miamighostchronicles.com, you can find links to the videos or MP3 files, which you can download and enjoy without commercial interruptions. If you're into classic horror, ghost, and adventure stories, I narrate Nightshade Diary, and you can find links at nightshadediary.com. If scary stories are your bag, and listening to encounters with cryptids, ghosts, dogman, and other weird creatures sends a shiver up your spine, then go to supernaturalstorytime.com for links to our weekly podcasts. Noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird can be found at eerie.news or visit the Stranger Than Fiction Stories tab at miamighostchronicles.com. Please subscribe to my newsletter on Substack. Just go to mppellicer.com for a link. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Stories of the Supernatural, and this week I've put together a collection of ghost stories because in truth this was the time of year when everyone would gather around and listen to spooky stories. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, a Happy New Year. Sit back and listen to Spirits of the Season, Christmas Ghost Stories. The Dead Sexton by J. Sheridan and Fanu. The sunsets were red, the nights were long, and the weather pleasantly frosty. And Christmas, the glorious herald of the new year, was at hand, when an event, still recounted by winter firesides, with a horror made delightful by the mellowing influence of years, occurred in the beautiful little town of Golden Friars, and signalized, as a scene of its catastrophe, the old inn, known throughout a wide region of the Northumbrian counties as the George and Dragon. Toby Crook, the sexton, was lying dead in the old coach house in the inn yard. The body had been discovered only half an hour before this story begins, under strange circumstances, and in a place where it might have lain the better part of a year undisturbed, and a dreadful suspicion astounded the village of Golden Friars. A wintry sunset was glaring through a gorge of the western mountains, turning into fire the twigs of the leafless elms, and all the tiny blades of grass on the green by which the quaint little town is surrounded. It is built of light gray stone with steep gables and slender chimneys rising with airy lightness from the level sward by the margin of the beautiful lake, and backed by the grand amphitheater of the fells at the other side, whose snowy peaks showed faintly against the sky, tinged with the vaporous red of the western light. As you descend towards the margin of the lake and see Golden Friars, its tapered chimneys and slender gables, its curious old inn and gorgeous sign, and over all the graceful tower and spire of the ancient church, at this hour or by moonlight, in the solemn grandeur and stillness of the natural scenery that surrounds it, stands before you like a fairy town. Toby Crook, the lank sexton, now 50 or upwards, had passed an hour or two with some village cronies over a solemn pot of pearl in the kitchen of that cozy hostelry the night before. He generally turned in there about 7 o'clock and heard the news. This contented him, for he talked little and looked always surly. Many things are now raked up and talked over about him. In early youth he had been a bit of a scamp. He broke his indentures and ran away from his master, the tanner of Briarmere. He had got into 50 bad scrapes and out again, and just as the little world of Golden Friars had come to the conclusion that it would be well for all parties, except perhaps himself, and a happy riddance for his afflicted mother, if he were sunk, with a gross of quart pots about his neck, in the bottom of the lake in which the grey gables, the elms, and the towering fells of Golden Friars are mirrored, he suddenly returned, a reformed man at the ripe age of 40. For 12 years he had disappeared, and no one knew what had become of him. Then suddenly, as I say, he reappeared at Golden Friars, a very black and silent man, sedate and orderly. His mother was dead and buried, but the prodigal son was received good-naturedly. The good vicar, Dr. General, reported to his wife, "His hard heart has been softened, dear Dolly. I saw him dry his eyes, poor fellow, at the sermon yesterday." "I don't wonder, Hugh, darling. I know the part. There is joy in heaven. I'm sure it was, wasn't it? It was quite beautiful. I almost cried myself." The vicar laughed gently and stooped over her chair and kissed her and patted her cheek fondly. "You think too well of your old man's sermons," he said. "I preach, you see, Dolly, very much to the poor. If they understand me, I am pretty sure everyone else must, and I think that my simple style goes more home to both feelings and conscience." "You ought to have told me of his crime before. You are so eloquent," exclaimed Dolly Jenner. "No one preaches like my man." "I have never heard such sermons." "Not many, for we may be sure, for the good lady had not heard more than 6 from any other divine for the last 20 years. The personages of Golden Friars talked Toby Crook over on his return. Dr. Lincote said, "He must have led a hard life, for he had dried in so, and a good deal of hard muscle, and he rather fancied he had been soldiering. He stood like a soldier, and the mark over his right eye looked like a gunshot. People might wonder how he could have survived a gunshot over the eye. But was not Lincote a doctor, and an army doctor to boot, when he was young, and who in Golden Friars could dispute with him on points of surgery? And I believe the truth is that this mark had been really made by a pistol bullet. Mr. Jarlcott, the attorney, would go bail. He had picked up some sense in his travels, and honest Turnbull, the host of the George and Dragon, said heartily, 'We must look out something for him to put his hands to. Now's the time to make a man of him.' The end of it was that he became, among other things, the sexton of Golden Friars. He was a punctual sexton. He meddled with no other person's business, but he was a silent man, and by no means popular. He was reserved in company, and he used to walk alone by the shore of the lake, while other fellows played at five or skittles, and when he visited the kitchen of the George, he had his liquor to himself, and in the midst of the general talk was the saturnine listener. There was something sinister in this man's face, and when things went wrong with him, he could look dangerous enough. There were whispered stories in Golden Friars about Toby Crook. Nobody could say how they got there. Nothing is more mysterious than the spread of rumor. It is like a vial poured on the air. It travels like an epidemic on the sightless currents of the atmosphere, or by the laws of a telluric influence equally intangible. These stories treated, though darkly, of the long periods of his absence from his native village, but they took no well-defined shape, and no one could refer them to any authentic source. The vicar's charity was of the kind that thinketh no evil, and in such cases he always insisted on proof. Crook was, of course, undisturbed in his office. On the evening before the tragedy came to light, trifles are always remembered after the catastrophe. A boy returning along the margin of the mere passed him by seated on a prostrate trunk of a tree, under the beeld of a rock, counting silver money. His lean body and limbs were bent together, his knees were up to his chin, and his long fingers were turning the coins over hurriedly in the hollow of his other hand. He glanced at the boy, as the old English saying is, like the devil looking over Lincoln. But a black and sour look from Mr. Crook, who never had a smile for a child, nor greeting for a wayfarer, was nothing strange. Toby Crook lived in the grey stone house, cold and narrow, that stands near the church porch, with a window of its staircase looking out into the churchyard, where so much of his labor for many a day had been expended. The greater part of this house was untenanted. The old woman who was in charge of it slept in a settle bed, among broken stools, old sacks, rotten chests, and other rattlestraps, in the small room at the rear of the house, floored with tiles. At what time of the night she could not tell, she awoke and saw a man with his hat on in her room. He had a candle in his hand, which he shaded with his coat from her eye. His back was towards her, and he was rummaging in the drawer in which he usually kept her money. Having got her quarter's pension of £2 that day, however, she had placed it, folded in a rag, in the corner of her tea caddy, and locked it up in the eat malison or cupboard. She was frightened when she saw the figure in her room, and she could not tell whether her visitor might not have made his entrance from the contiguous churchyard. So, sitting bolt upright in her bed, her grey hair almost lifting her kerchief off her head, and all over in a fit of the creepins, as she expressed it, she demanded, "In God's name, what want you there? Where's the peppermint you use to hive by you, woman? I'm bad with an inward pain." "It's all gone, a month since," she answered, and offered to make him a hot drink if he'd get to his room. But he said, "Never mind, I'll try a mouthful of gin." And turning on his heel, he left her. In the morning the sexton was gone. Not only in his lodging was there no account of him, but when inquiry began to be extended, nowhere in the village of Golden Friars could he be found. Still, he might have gone off, on business of his own, to some distant village, before the town was stirring, and the sexton had no near kindred to trouble their heads about him. People, therefore, were willing to wait, and take his return ultimately for granted. At 3 o'clock, the good vicar, standing at his hall door, looking across the lake towards the noble fells that rise steep and furrowed from that beautiful mere, saw two men approaching across the green, in a straight line, from a boat that was moored at the water's edge. They were carrying between them something which, though not very large, seemed ponderous. "You'll ken this, sir," said one of the boatmen, as they set down, almost at his feet, a small church bell, such as in old-fashioned chimes yield the treble notes. "This won't be less nor 5 steen. I want it for the church steeple yon." "What? One of our church bells?" ejaculated the vicar, for a moment lost in horrible amazement. "Oh, no, no. That can't possibly be. Where did you find it?" He had found the boat in the morning, moored about 50 yards from her moorings, where he had left it the night before, and could not think how that came to pass. And now, as he and his partner were about to take their oars, they discovered this bell in the bottom of the boat, under a bit of canvas, also the sexton's pick and spade. Tomsid, they termed that peculiar, broad-bladed implement. "Very extraordinary. We must try whether there is a bell missing from the tower," said the vicar, getting into a fuss. "Has Crook come back yet? Does anyone know where he is?" The sexton had not yet turned up. "That's odd. That's provoking," said the vicar. "However, my key will let us in. Place the bell in the hall while I get it, and then we can see what all this means." To the church accordingly they went, the vicar leading the way, with his own key in his hand. He turned it in the lock, and stood in the shadow of the ground porch, and shut the door. A sack, half full, lay on the ground, with open mouth a piece of cord lying beside it. Something clanked within it as one of the men shoved it aside with his clumsy shoe. The vicar opened the church door and peeped in. The dusky glow from the western sky, entering through a narrow window, illuminated the shafts and arches, the old oak carvings, and the discolored monuments, with a melancholy glare of a dying fire. The vicar withdrew his head and closed the door. The gloom of the porch was deeper than ever, as stooping he entered the narrow door that opened at the foot of the winding stair that leads to the first loft, from which a rude ladder stair of wood, some 25 feet in height, mounts through a trap to the ringer's loft. Up the narrow stairs the vicar climbed, followed by his attendants, to the very first loft. It was dark. A narrow bow-slit in the thick wall admitted the only light they had to guide them. The ivy leaves, seen from the deep shadow, flashed and flickered redly, and the sparrows twittered among them. "Will one of you be so good as to go up and count the bells, and see if they are all right?" said the vicar. "There should be—" "Agoy! What's that?" exclaimed one of the men, recoiling from the foot of the ladder. "By Jen!" ejaculated the other, in equal surprise. "Good gracious!" gasped the vicar, who, seeing distinctly a dark mass lying on the floor, had stooped to examine it, and placed his hand upon a cold dead face. The men drew the body into the streak of light that traversed the floor. It was the corpse of Toby Crook. There was a frightful scar across his forehead. The alarm was given. Dr. Lincoat and Mr. Jarlcott and Turnbull of the George and Dragon were on the spot immediately, and many curious and horrified spectators of minor importance. The first thing certain was that the man must have been many hours dead. The next was that his skull was fractured across the forehead by an awful blow. The next was that his neck was broken. His hat was found on the floor, where he had probably laid it with his handkerchief in it. The mystery now began to clear a little, for a bell, one of the chime hung in the tower, was found where it had rolled to, against the wall, with blood and hair on the rim of it, which corresponded with the grisly fracture across the front of his head. The sack that lay in the vestibule was examined, and found to contain all the church plate, a silver salver that had disappeared about a month before from Dr. Lincoat's store of valuables, the vicar's gold pencil case, which he had thought he had forgotten in the vestry book, silver spoons, and various other contributions, levied from time to time off a dozen different households, the mysterious disappearance of which spoils had of late years begun to make the honest little community uncomfortable. 2 bells had been taken down from the chime, and now the shrewd part of the assemblage, putting things together, began to comprehend the nefarious plans of the sexton, who lay mangled and dead on the floor of the tower, where only 2 days ago he had told the holy bell to call the good Christians of Golden Friars to worship. The body was carried into the yard of the George and Dragon and laid in the old coach-house, and the townfolk came grouping in to have a peep at the corpse, and stood round, looking darkly and talking as low as if they were in a church. The vicar, in gaiters and slightly shovel hat, stood erect as one in a little circle of notables. The doctor, the attorney, Sir Geoffrey Mardykes, who happened to be in the town, and Turnbull, the host, in the centre of the paved yard, they having made an inspection of the body, at which troops of the village stragglers, toing and froing, were gaping and frowning as they whispered their horrible conjectures. "What do you think of that?" said Tom Scales, the old hostler of the George, looking pale, with a stern, faint smile on his lips, as he and Dick Lincoln sauntered out of the coach-house together. "The deal will have his end now," answered Dick in his friend's ear. "The sexton's got a craig through like he gave the last over the clints of Scarsdale. You mind what the old soger told us when he hid his face in the kitchen of the George here? By Jen, I'll ne'er forget that story." "I want 'twas all true enough," replied the hostler. "And the size up he gave the sleeping man with the poker across the forehead? See where the edge of the bell took him and smashed him? The same lids. By my sang, I wonder the deal did not carry away his corpse in the night, as he did with Tom Launders at Moulturn Mill. Hot man, whoever said devil inside a church? The corpse, it's enough to scare Satan himself, for that matter. Though it's true what you say. Aye, you're right, for Beelzebub don't show his snot inside the church, not the length or the back of my nail." While this discussion was going on, the gentlefolk who were talking the matter over in the centre of the yard had dispatched a message for the coroner all the way to the town of Sexton. The last tint of sunset was fading from the sky by this time, so of course there was no thought of an inquest earlier than the next day. In the meantime, it was horribly clear that the sexton had intended to rob the church of its plate, and had lost his life in the attempt to carry the second bell, as we have seen, down the worn ladder of the tower. He had tumbled backwards and broken his neck upon the floor of the loft, and the heavy bell, in its fall, descended with its edge across his forehead. Never was a man more completely killed by a double catastrophe in a moment. The bells and the contents of the sack, it was surmised, he meant to have conveyed across the lake that night, and with the help of his spade and pick to have buried them in Clousted Forest, and returned, after an absence of but a few hours, as he easily might, before morning, unmissed and unobserved. He would no doubt, having secured his booty, have made such arrangements as would have made it appear that the church had been broken into. He would, of course, have taken all measures to divert suspicion from himself, and have watched a suitable opportunity to repossess himself of the buried treasure and dispose of it in safety. And now come out, into sharp relief all the stories that had, one way or other, stolen after him into the town. Old Mrs. Pullen fainted when she saw him, and told Dr. Lincoat after that she thought he was the highwayman who fired the shot that killed the coachman the night they were robbed on Hounslow Heath. There were the stories also told by the wayfaring old soldier with a wooden leg, and 50 others, up to this more than half disregarded, but which now seized on the popular belief with a startling grasp. The fleeting light soon expired, and twilight was succeeded by the early night. The inn-yard gradually became quiet, and the dead sexton lay alone in the dark on his back, locked up in the old coach-house, the key of which was safe in the pocket of Tom Scales, the trusty old hostler of the George. It was about 8 o'clock, and the hostler, standing alone on the road in the front of the open door of the George and Dragon, had just smoked his pipe out. A bright moon hung in the frosty sky. The fells rose from the opposite edge of the lake like phantom mountains. The air was stirless. Through the boughs and sprays of the leafless elms no sigh or motion, however hushed, was audible. Not a ripple glimmered on the lake, which at one point only reflected the brilliant moon from its dark blue expanse like burnished steel. The road that runs by the inn door along the margin of the lake shone dazzlingly white, white as ghosts. Among the dark holly and juniper stood the tall piers of the vicar's gate, and their great stone balls like heads, overlooking the same road, a few hundred yards up the lake to the left. The early little town of Golden Friars was quiet by this time, except for the townsfolk, who were now collected in the kitchen of the inn itself. No inhabitant was now outside his own threshold. Tom Scales was thinking of turning in. He was beginning to feel a little queer. He was thinking of the sexton, and could not get the fixed features of the dead man out of his head, when he heard the sharp though distinct ring of a horse's hoof upon the frozen road. Tom's instinct apprised him of the approach of a guest to the George and Dragon. His experienced ear told him that the horseman was approaching by the Dardale road, which, after crossing that wide and dismal moss, passes the southern fells by Dunnerclog, and finally enters the town of Golden Friars by joining the Mardykes road at the edge of the lake, close to the gate of the vicar's house. A clump of tall trees stood at this point, but the moon shone full upon the road and cast her shadow backward. The hoofs were plainly coming at a gallop, with a hollow rattle. The horseman was a long time in appearing. Tom wondered how he had heard the sound, so sharply frosty as the air was, so very far away. He was right in his guess. The visitor was coming over the mountainous road from Dardale Moss, and he now saw a horseman, who must have turned the corner of the vicar's house at the moment when his eye was wearied, for when he saw him for the first time, he was advancing in the hazy moonlight like the shadow of a cavalier at a gallop upon the level strip of road that skirts the margin of the mere, between the George and the vicar's piers. The hostler had not long to wonder why the rider pushed his beast at so furious a pace, and now he came to have heard him, as he now calculated at least 3 miles away. A very few moments sufficed to bring horse and rider to the inn door. It was a powerful black horse, something like the great Irish hunter that figured 100 years ago, and would carry 16 stone with ease across country. It would have made a grand charger. Not a hair turned, it snorted, it pawed, it arched its neck, then threw back its ears and down its head. It looked ready to lash, and then to rear, and seemed impatient to be off again, and incapable of standing quiet for a moment. The rider got down, as light as shadow falls, but he was a tall, sinewy figure. He wore a cape or short mantle, a cocked hat, and a pair of jack-boots, such as held their ground in some primitive corners of England almost to the close of the last century. "Take him, lad," said he to old Scales. "You need not walk or wisp him. He never sweats or tires. Give him his oats, and let him take his own time to eat them." "House!" cried the stranger, in the old-fashioned form of summons, which still lingered at that time in out-of-the-way places, in a deep and piercing voice. As Tom Scales led the horse away to the stables, it turned its head towards its master, with a short, shrill neigh. "About your business, old gentleman. We must not go too fast," the stranger cried back again to his horse, with a laugh as harsh and piercing, and he strode into the house. The hostler led his horse into the inn-yard, and passing it sidled up to the coach-house gate, within which lay the dead sexton, snorted Pod, and lowered its head suddenly, with ear close to the plank as if listening for a sound from within, then uttered again the same short, piercing neigh. The hostler was chilled at this mysterious coquetry with the dead. He liked the brute less and less every minute. In the meantime its master had proceeded. "I'll go to the inn kitchen," he said, in his startling bass, to the drawer who met him in the passage, and on he went, as if he had known the place all his days, not seeming to hurry himself, stepping leisurely, the servant thought, but gliding on at such a rate, nevertheless, that he had passed his guide, and was in the kitchen of the George before he had got much more than halfway to it. A roaring fire of dry wood, peat, and coal lighted up this snug but spacious apartment, flashing on pots and pans and dressers high piled with pewter plates and dishes, and making the uncertain shadows of the long hanks of onions and many a flitch and ham, depending from the ceiling, dancing on its glowing surface. The doctor and the attorney, even Sir Geoffrey Mardyke, did not disdain on this occasion to take chairs and smoke their pipes by the kitchen fire, where they were in the thick of the gossip and discussion excited by the terrible event. The tall stranger entered uninvited. He looked like a gaunt, athletic Spaniard of 40, burned half black in the sun, with a bony, flattened nose. A pair of fierce black eyes were just visible under the edge of his hat, and his mouth seemed divided, beneath the mustache, by the deep scar of a hare-lip. Sir Geoffrey Mardyke and the host of the George, aided by the doctor and the attorney, were discussing and arranging, for the third or fourth time, their theories about the death and the probable plans of Toby Crook, when the stranger entered. The newcomer lifted his hat, with a sort of smile, for a moment from his black head. "What do you call this place, gentlemen?" asked the stranger. "The town of Goldenfriars, sir," answered the doctor politely. "The George and Dragon, sir. Anthony Turnbull at your service," answered mine host with a solemn bow, at the same moment, so that the two voices went together, as if the doctor and the innkeeper were singing a catch. "The George and the Dragon," repeated the horseman, expanding his long hands over the fire which he had approached. "St. George, King George, the Dragon. The devil. It is a very grand idol, that outside your door, sir. You catch all sort of worshippers, courtiers, fanatics, scamps, all's fish. Everybody welcome, provided he drinks like one. Suppose you brew a bowl or two of punch. I'll stand it. How many are we? Here, count, and let us have enough. Gentlemen, I mean to spend the night here, and my horse is in the stable. What holiday, fun, or fair has got so many pleasant faces together? When I last called here, for, now I bethink me, I have seen the place before, you all looked sad. It was on a Sunday, that dismal list of holidays, and it would have been positively melancholy, only that your sexton, that saint upon earth, Mr. Crook, was here. He was looking around over his shoulder and added, 'Ha! Don't I see him there?' Frightened a good deal were some of the company, all gaped in the direction in which with a nod he turned his eyes. 'He's not there. He can't be there.' 'We see he's not there,' said Turnbull, as dogmatically as old Joe Willet might have delivered himself, for he did not care that the George should earn the reputation of a haunted house. 'He's met an accident, sir. He's dead. He's elsewhere, and therefore can't be here.' Upon this the company entertained the stranger with a narrative, which they made easy by division of labor, two or three generally speaking at a time, and no one being permitted to finish a second sentence without finding himself corrected and supplanted. 'The man's in heaven, so sure as you're not,' said the traveller, so soon as the story was ended. 'What? He was fiddling with the church bell, was he? And damned for that. Landlord, get us some drink. A sexton damned for pulling down a church bell. He has been pulling at for 10 years. You came, sir, by the Dardale Road, I believe,' said the doctor. 'Registered folks are curious. A dismal moss is Dardale Moss, sir, and a bleak climb up the fells onto the other side.' 'I say yes to all. From Dardale Moss, as black as pitch and as rotten as the grave, up that zigzag wall you call a road, that looks like chalk in the moonlight, through Dunner Clog, as dark as a coal pit, And down here to the George and the Dragon, where you have a roaring fire, wise men, good punch. Here it is, and a corpse in your coach house. Where the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Come, landlord, ladle out the nectar. Drink, gentlemen, drink all. Brew another bowl at the bar. How divinely it stinks of alcohol. I hope you like it, gentlemen. It smells all over of spices, like a mummy. Drink, friends. Ladle, landlord, drink all, serve it out. The guest fumbled in his pocket and produced 3 guineas, which he slipped into Turnbull's fat palm. Let punch flow till that's out. I'm an old friend of the house. I call here. Back and forward. I know you well, Turnbull, though you don't recognize me. You have the advantage of me, sir, said Mr. Turnbull, looking hard on that dark and sinister countenance, which, or the like of which, he could have sworn he had never seen before in his life. But he liked the weight and color of the guineas as he dropped them into his pocket. I hope you'll find yourself comfortable while you stay. You have given me a bedroom? Yes, sir, the cedar chamber. I know it, the very thing. No, no punch for me. By and by, perhaps. The talk went on, but the stranger had grown silent. He had seated himself on an oak bench by the fire, towards which he extended his feet and hands with seeming enjoyment, his cocked hat being, however, a little over his face. Gradually the company began to thin. Sir Geoffrey Mordaunt was the first to go, then some of the humbler townsfolk. The last bowl of punch was on its last legs. The stranger walked into the passage and said to the drawer, "Fetch me a lantern. I must see my nag. Light it, hey? That will do. No, you need not come." The gaunt traveller took it from the man's hand and strode along the passage to the door of the stable-yard, which he opened and passed out. Tom Scales, standing on the pavement, was looking through the stable window at the horses when the stranger plucked his shirt-sleeve. With an inward shock, the hostler found himself alone in presence of the very person he had been thinking of. "I say, they tell me you have something to look at in there." He pointed with his thumb at the old coach-house door. "Let us have a peep." Tom Scales happened to be at that moment in a state of mind highly favorable to anyone in search of a submissive instrument. He was in great perplexity and even perturbation. He suffered the stranger to lead him to the coach-house gate. "You must come in and hold the lantern," said he. "I'll pay you handsomely." The old hostler applied his key and removed the padlock. "What are you afraid of? Step in and throw the light on his face," said the stranger grimly. "Throw open the lantern. Stand there. Stoop over him a little. He won't bite you. Steady, or you may pass the night with him." In the meantime, the company at the George had dispersed, and shortly after, Anthony Turnbull, who, like a good landlord, was always last in bed and first up in his house, was taking alone his last look around the kitchen before making his final visit to the stable-yard, when Tom Scales tottered into the kitchen looking like death, his hair standing upright, and he sat down on an oak chair, all in a tremble, wiped his forehead with his hand, and instead of speaking heaved a great sigh or two. It was not till after he had swallowed a dram of brandy that he found his voice and said, "We've the devil himself in the house, by Jen. You best send for the the clergyman. Happen he'll take him in hand with Holy Writ and send him elsewhere deftly. Lord, between us and harm, I'm a sinful man, I tell you, Mr. Turnbull. I daren't stop in the George tonight under the same roof with him." "You mean the black-faced lad with the broken nose?" "That's a gentleman with a pocket full of guineas, man, and a horse worth £50. That horse is no better nor his rider. The nags that were in the stable with him, they all took to creepings and sweated like rain down a thack. I took them all out that way, away from him, into the hack stable, and I thought I could never get them past him. But that's not all. When I was looking in the window at the nags, he comes behind me and claps his claw on my shoulder, and he asked me to open the coach-house door, and I held it for him till he peeked into the dead man's face. And as God's my judge, I said the corpse opened its eyes and worked its mouth like a man snoring and striving to talk. I couldn't move or say a word, though I felt my hair rising on my head. But at long last I gave a yell, and I said, 'What is that?' and he himself looked round on me like the devil he is, and with a skirl of a laugh, he strikes the lantern out of my hand. When I come to myself, we were outside the coach-house door. The moon was shining in, and I could see the corpse stretched out on the table where we left it, and he kicked the door with his foot. "Lock it," says he, and so I did, and here's the key for you. Take it yourself, sir. He offered me money. He said he'd make me a rich man if I'd sell him the corpse and help him away with it. Halt, man. What could he want with a corpse? He's not a doctor to do that. He was taking a rising, lad, said Turnbull. No, he wants the corpse. There's something you can't tell me he wants to do with it, and he's thieving it in the damage of my soul. He's one of them at Dardale Moss that's always astir with like after nightfall, unless, Lord save us, he be the devil himself. Where is he now? Asked the landlord, who was growing uncomfortable. He sprang up the back stair to his room. I wonder you didn't hear him tramping like a wild horse, and he clapped his door that the house shook again. But Lord knows where he is now. Let us go away up to the vicar and get him to come down and talk with him. Hoity-toity, man. You're too easy scared, said the landlord, pale enough by this time. To be a fine thing, truly, to send abroad that the house was haunted by the devil himself. Why, 'twould be the ruin of the George. You're sure you locked the door on the corpse? Aye, sir. Certain. Come with me, Tom. We'll get a last look round the yard. So side by side, with many a jealous look right and left, and over their shoulders they went in silence. On entering the old-fashioned quadrangle, surrounded by stables and other offices, built in the antique cagework fashion, they stopped for a while under the shadow of the inn gable, and looked round the yard and listened. All was silent, nothing stirring. The stable lantern was lighted, and with it in his hand Tony Turnbull, holding Tom Scales by the shoulder, advanced. He hauled Tom after him for a step or two, then stood still and shoved him before him for a step or two more, and thus cautiously as a pair of skirmishers under fire, they approached the coach-house door. There, you see, all safe, whispered Tom, pointing to the lock which hung, distinct in the moonlight, in its place. Come back, I say. Come on, say I, retorted the landlord valorously. It would never do to allow any tricks to be played with a chap in there, he pointed to the coach-house door. The coroner here in the morning, and never a corpse to sit on. He unlocked the padlock with these words, having handed the lantern to Tom. Here, look in, Tom, he continued. You have the lantern, and see if all's you left it. Not me, no, not for the George, and that's in it, said Tom, with a shudder sternly, as he took a step backward. What are you afraid on? Give me the lantern. It is all one, I will. And cautiously, little by little, he opened the door, and holding the lantern over his head in the narrow slit, he peeped in, frowning and pale with one eye, as if he expected something to fly in his face. He closed the door without speaking, and locked it again. As safe as a thief in a mill, he whispered, with a nod to his companion, and at that moment a harsh laugh overheard broke the silence startlingly, and set all the poultry in the yard gabbling. There he be, said Tom, clutching the landlord's arm. In the window, see? The window of the cedar room, up 2 pairs of stairs, was open. In the shadow, a darker outline was visible of a man, with his elbows on the window stone, looking down upon them. Look at his eyes, like 2 live coals, gasped Tom. The landlord could not see all this so sharply, being confused and not so long-sighted as Tom. Time, sir, called Tony Turnbull, turning cold as he thought he saw a pair of eyes shining down redly at him. Time for honest folk to be in their beds and asleep. As sound as your sexton, said the jeering voice from above. Come out of this, whispered the landlord fiercely to his hostler, plucking him hard by the sleeve. They got into the house and shut the door. I wish we were shot of him, said the landlord, with something like a groan as he leaned against the wall of the passage. I'll sit up anyhow, and Tom, you'll sit with me. Come into the gun-room. No one shall steal the dead man out of my yard while I can draw trigger. The gun-room in the George is about 12 feet square. It projects into the stable yard and commands a full view of the old coach-house, and through a narrow side window a flanking view of the back door of the inn, through which the yard is reached. Tony Turnbull took down the blunderbuss, which was the great ordnance of the house, and loaded it with a stiff charge of pistol bullets. He put on a great coat which hung there, and was his covering when he went out at night to shoot wild ducks. Tom made himself comfortable likewise. They then sat down at the window, which was open looking into the yard, the opposite side of which was white in the brilliant moonlight. The landlord laid the blunderbuss across his knees and stared into the yard. His comrade stared also. The door of the gun room was locked, so they felt tolerably secure. An hour passed. Nothing had occurred. Another. The clock struck 1. The shadows had shifted a little, but still the moon shone full on the old coach house and the stable where the guest horse stood. Turnbull thought he heard a step on the back stair. Tom was watching the back door through the side window, with eyes glazing with the intensity of his stare. Anthony Turnbull, holding his breath, listened at the room door. It was a false alarm. When he came back to the window looking into the yard, "Hush! Look there!" said he in a vehement whisper. From the shadow at the left they saw the figure of the gaunt horseman in short cloak and jack-boots emerge. He pushed open the stable door and let out his powerful black horse. He walked it across the front of the building till he reached the old coach-house door, and there with its bridle on its neck, he left it standing while he stalked to the yard gate, and dealing it a kick with his heel, it sprang back with a rebound, shaking from top to bottom, and stood open. The stranger returned to the side of his horse, and the door which secured the corpse of the dead sexton seemed to swing slowly open of itself as he entered, and returned with the corpse in his arms, and swung it across the shoulders of the horse, and instantly sprang into the saddle. "Fire!" shouted Tom, and bang went the blunderbuss with a stunning crack. 1,000 sparrows' wings winnowed through the air from the thick ivy. The watchdog yelled a furious bark. There was a strange ring and whistle in the air. The blunderbuss had burst into shivers right down to the very breech. The recoil rolled the innkeeper upon his back on the floor, and Tom's scales was flung against the side of the recess of the window, which had saved him from a tumble as violent. In this position they heard the scarring laugh of the departing horseman, and saw him right out of the gate with his ghastly burden. Perhaps some of my readers, like myself, have heard this story told by Roger Turnbull, now host of the George and Dragon, the grandson of the very Tony who then swayed the spigot and keys of that inn, in the identical kitchen of which the fiend treated so many of the neighbors to punch. What infernal object was subserved by the possession of the dead villain's body? I have not learned, but a very curious story in which a vampire resuscitation of Crook the Sexton figures may throw a light upon this part of the tale. The result of Turnbull's shot at the disappearing fiend certainly justifies old Andrew Morton's dictum, which is thus expressed in his curious History of Apparitions. He who pretends not to fear the devil are for using the ordinary violences with him, which affect one man from another, or with an apparition in which they may be sure to receive some mischief. I know one fired a gun at an apparition, and the gun burst in 100 pieces in his hand. Another struck at an apparition with a sword, and broke his sword in pieces, and wounded his hand grievously. And 'tis next to madness for anyone to go that way to work with any spirit, be it angel or be it devil. Across the Moors by William Fryer Harvey. It really was most unfortunate. Peggy had a temperature of nearly 100 and a pain in her side, and Mrs. Workington Bancroft knew that it was appendicitis, but there was no one whom she could send for the doctor. James had gone with a jaunting car to meet her husband, who had at last managed to get away for a week's shooting. Adolphe she had sent to the Evershams only half an hour before with a note for Lady Ava. The cook could not manage to walk, even if dinner could be served without her. Kate, as usual, was not to be trusted. There remained Miss Craig. "Of course, you must see that Peggy is really ill," said she, as a governess came into the room in answer to her summons. "The difficulty is that there is absolutely no one whom I can send for the doctor." Mrs. Workington Bancroft paused. She was always willing that those beneath her should have the privilege of offering the services which it was her right to command. "So perhaps, Miss Craig," she went on, You would not mind walking over to Tebbett's farm? I hear there's a Liverpool doctor staying there. Of course, I know nothing about him, but we must take the risk, and I expect he'll be only too glad to be earning something during his holiday. It's nearly 4 miles, I know, and I'd never dream of asking you if it was not that I dread appendicitis so. Very well, said Miss Craig. I suppose I must go, but I don't know the way. Oh, you can't miss it, said Mrs. Workington Bancroft, in her anxiety temporarily forgiving the obvious unwillingness of her governess' consent. You follow the road across the moor for 2 miles, until you come to Redman's Cross. You turn to the left there, and follow a rough path that leads through a large plantation, and Tebbett's farm lies just below you in the valley. And take Pontiff with you, she added, as the girl left the room. There's absolutely nothing to be afraid of, but I expect you'll feel happier with a dog. Well, miss, said the cook when Miss Craig went into the kitchen to get her boots, which had been drying by the fire. Of course she knows best, but I don't think it's right after all that's happened for the mistress to send you across the moors on a night like this. It's not as if the doctor could do anything for Miss Margaret if you do bring him. Every child is like that once in a while. You only put her to bed, and she's there already. I don't see what there is to be afraid of, cook, said Miss Craig, as she laced her boots, unless you believe in ghosts. I'm not so sure about that. Anyhow, I don't like sleeping in a bed where the sheets are too short for you to pull them over your head. But don't you frighten, miss. It's my belief that their bark is worse than their bite. But though Miss Craig amused herself for some minutes by trying to imagine the bark of a ghost, a thing altogether different from the classical ghostly bark, she did not feel entirely at her ease. She was naturally nervous, and living as she did in the hinterland of the servants' hall, she had heard vague details of true stories that were only myths in the drawing-room. The very name of Redman's Cross sent a shiver through her. It must have been the place where that horrid murder was committed. She had forgotten the tale, though she remembered the name. Her first disaster came soon enough. Pontiff, who was naturally slow-witted, took more than 5 minutes to find out that it was only the governess he was escorting, but once the discovery had been made, he promptly turned tail, paying not the slightest heed to Miss Craig's feeble whistle, and then to add to her discomfort the rain came, not in heavy drops, but driving in sheets of thin spray that blotted out what few landmarks there were upon the moor. They were very kind at Tebbett's farm. The doctor had gone back to Liverpool the day before, but Mrs. Tebbett gave her hot milk and turf cake, and offered her reluctant son to show Miss Craig a shorter path on the moor that avoided the larch wood. He was a monosyllabic youth, but his presence was cheering, and she felt the night doubly black when he left her at the last gate. She trudged on wearily. Her thoughts had already gone back on the most exhausted theme of the bark of ghosts, when she heard steps on the road behind her that were at least material. Next minute the figure of a man appeared. Miss Craig was relieved to see that the stranger was a clergyman. He raised his hat. "I believe we are both going in the same direction," he said. "Perhaps I may have the pleasure of escorting you." She thanked him. "It is rather weird at night," she went on, "and what with all the tales of ghosts and bogies that one hears from the country people, I've ended by being half afraid myself." "I can understand your nervousness," he said, "especially in a night like this. I used at one time to feel the same, for my work often meant lonely walks across the moor to farms which were only reached by rough tracks difficult enough to find even in the daytime." "And you never saw anything to frighten you? Nothing immaterial, I mean?" "I can't really say that I did, but I had an experience 11 years ago which served as a turning point in my life, and since you seem to be now in much the same state of mind as I was then in, I will tell it to you. The time of year was late September. I had been over to Westendale to see an old woman who was dying, and then just as I was about to start on my way home, word came to me of another of my parishioners who had been suddenly taken ill only that morning. It was after 7 when at last I started. A farmer saw me on my way, turning back when I reached the moor road. The sunset the previous evening had been one of the most lovely I remember seeing. The whole vault of heaven had been scattered with flakes of white cloud, tipped with rosy pink like strewn petals of a full-blown rose. But that night all was changed. The sky was absolutely dull slate color, except in one corner of the west where a thin rift showed the last saffron tint of the sullen sunset. As I walked, stiff and footsore, my spirit sank. It must have been the marked contrast between the two evenings. The one so lovely, so full of promise. The corn was still out in the fields, spoiling for fine weather. The other so gloomy, so sad, with all the dead weight of autumn and winter days to come. And then, added to the sense of heavy depression, came another different feeling, which I surprised myself by recognizing as fear. I did not know why I was afraid. The moors lay on either side of me, unbroken except for a straggling line of turf shooting butts that stood within a stone's throw of the road. The only sound I had heard for the last half hour was the cry of the startled grouse. Go back, go back, go back. But yet the feeling of fear was there, affecting a low center of my brain through some little used psychical channel. I buttoned my coat closer and tried to divert my thoughts by thinking of next Sunday's sermon. I had chosen to preach on Job. There is much in the old-fashioned notion of the book, apart from all the subtleties of the higher criticism, that appeals to country folk, the loss of herds and crop, the breakup of the family. I would not have dared to speak had I not been a farmer. My own glebe land had been flooded 3 weeks before, and I suppose I stood to lose as much as any man in the parish. As I walked along the road, repeating it to myself, the first chapter of the book, I stopped at the 12th verse. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. The thought of the bad harvest, and that is an awful thought in these valleys, vanished. I seemed to gaze into an ocean of infinite darkness. I had often used, with the Sunday glibness of the tired priest, whose duty is to preach 3 sermons in one day, the old simile of the chessboard. God and the devil were the players, and we were helping one side or the other. But until that night, I had not thought of the possibility of my being only a pawn in the game, that God might throw away, that the game might be won. I had reached the place where we are now. I remember it by that rough stone water trough, when a man suddenly jumped up from the roadside. He had been seated on a heap of broken road metal. "Which way are you going, governor?" he said. I knew from the way he spoke that the man was a stranger. There are many at this time of the year who come up from the south, tramping northward with the ripening corn. I told him my destination. "We'll go along together," he replied. It was too dark to see much of the man's face, but what little I made out was coarse and brutal. Then he began the half-menacing whine I knew so well. He had tramped miles that day. He had no food since breakfast, and that was only a crust. "Give us a copper," he said. "It's only for a night's lodging." He was whittling away with a big clasp knife at an ash stake he had taken from some hedge. The clergyman broke off. "Are those the lights of your house?" he said. "We are nearer than I expected, but I shall have time to finish my story. I think I will, for you can run home in a couple of minutes, and I don't want you to be frightened when you are out in the moors again." As the man talked, he seemed to have stepped out of the very background of my thoughts, his sordid tale, with the sad lies that hid a far sadder truth. He asked me the time. It was 5 minutes to 9. As I replaced my watch, I glanced at his face. His teeth were clenched, and there was something in the gleam of his eyes that told me at once his purpose. Have you ever known how long a second is? For the third of a second, I stood there facing him, filled with an overwhelming pity for myself and him. And then, without a word of warning, he was upon me. I felt nothing. A flash of lightning ran down my spine. I heard the dull crash of the ash stake, and then a very gentle patter like the sound of a far distant stream. For a minute I lay in perfect happiness, watching the lights of the house as they increased in number until the whole heaven shone with twinkling lamps. I could not have had a more painless death. Miss Craig looked up. The man was gone. She was alone on the moor. She ran to the house, her teeth chattering, ran to the solid shadow that crossed and recrossed the kitchen blind. As she entered the hall, the clock on the stairs struck the hour. It was 9 o'clock. The Closed Door by Harold Ward. Dying Obie Marsh cursed his wife as he had cursed her every day of their wedded life. "You've poisoned me," he gasped, writhing in agony. "Yes, you've poisoned me, you she-devil." Lucinda, his wife, nodded dully. "Yes, I poisoned you," she answered without emotion. You are going to die, anyway. The doctor said so. It's just a matter of time. Maybe years, maybe months. And I can't stand this fighting any longer. 15 years of it. 15 years of hell. Damn you. Marsh snarled through his clenched teeth, his bearded face twitching as a spasm of pain shot through his vitals. We should have never got married, the woman went on quietly. I never loved you, and you never loved me. It was a case of your folks and my folks sticking in between us and the ones we loved. You've always hated me 'cause of Lizzie Roper, and God knows I wanted to marry Al Sides. Just 'cause they wanted the farms joined, they made us get married, me and you. Now we can't get a divorce 'cause of the church, and I've just got sick of it, Obie. Sick of it all. You hellion, he gasped, his body twitching spasmodically. I got the idea of poisoning you when you first took sick, she went on in the same even tone. Old Doc Plummer said that you might linger along for years, and I just couldn't stand it, Obie. I just couldn't stand it any longer. Your constant bullying and running over me. You'll hang for it, Marsh said huskily. I hope they torture you in hell. Probably they will, Lucinda Marsh answered without emotion, but it's worth it to have a little peace here on earth. It hasn't been any heaven living with you. Marsh twisted convulsively, his gnarled fingers closing and unclosing, his thick lips drooling. He pulled himself together with a mighty effort. He was a hard man and strong. Hard men are difficult to kill. I'll come back. From the grave, you hussy, he gasped. 'Twould be like you, his wife answered. Waiting for you, he went on, trying to shake his fist in the woman's face. The effort was too great. He dropped back upon the pillow again, the sweat standing out on his forehead in beads, his body shaking with spasms. God, it hurts, he whispered, just like a knife. The woman suddenly lifted her head. She was listening. Somebody coming, she muttered, moving swiftly to the window. A roadster was entering the lane. It's old Doc Plummer, she said, half to herself, half to the dying man. The old fool's earlier than usual. And you can still talk. The man on the bed quivered. His fists clenched and his muscles tensed as he tried to drag himself back from the yawning pit that awaited him. Getting dark. Doc's liable to recognize his symptoms, the woman went on as she heard the car come to a stop in the front yard. A sheet had been thrown carelessly across the foot of the bed. Seizing it, she wadded it into a bundle and pressed it against the face of the dying man. He fought against the stoppage of his breath with a feeble effort. She threw her whole strength against him. Suddenly his limbs straightened jerkily. She knew that he was dead. She sat up with a sigh of relief. The outside screen door slammed shut. Leaping to her feet, she threw the sheet across the back of a chair and turned to meet the doctor. He just passed away in one of those spells, she said without emotion. Come on him all of a sudden. Both the kids are at school and I don't have nobody to send for you. 'Tain't no use to say I'm sorry, for I'm not. I'm glad he's dead. The physician shook his head sympathetically. Like all country practitioners, he was conversant with the family affairs of his patients. For a moment, he stood looking down at the still form of Obie Marsh. Then he pulled his sheet over it and turned to the woman. Better sit down and take things easy, Mrs. Marsh, he said, following her into the other room. I'll notify the undertaker and stop at the school and have the teacher send Mary and Jimmy home. Anybody else you want? She shook her head negatively. Tell Bill Reynolds to come prepared to take the body back with him, she said slowly. This is my house now, mine. That's the way my pap and his pap fixed up the deeds, and the quicker I get him out of my sight, the better it'll suit me. I never want to see him again till the day of the funeral, and I wouldn't intend that if it wasn't that people talk. He made life hell for me, she went on bitterly. I've hated him from the day I married him. It's my house now, and I'm going to lock that room as soon as they take him away. I never want to see the inside of it again. There's too many memories hovering around it. I'd burn it to the ground if it wasn't for burning the rest of the house. She dropped into a rocking chair and gazed at the doctor, her gaunt body quivering with unshed tears. The physician patted her on the shoulder sympathetically. "You're overwrought, Lucinda," he said kindly. "Overwrought and nervous. I'll fix up a tonic and bring it over tonight." "I don't need no tonic," she responded. "Knowing he's dead, it'll be tonic enough for me." The physician wagged his head solemnly. "Let's not speak ill of the dead," he said. "Everybody knows how he treated you. If there's nothing else I can do, I'll be getting along." In due time the undertaker and his assistant came with their narrow wicker basket. Lucinda Marsh stood beside the door and waited for them as they carried their burden out. They looked at her queerly as she turned the key in the lock, then removing it, placed it in her pocket. "I hope to God I never see inside of that room till my dying day," she said. Bill Reynolds, the undertaker, shook his head in agreement. He, too, knew the life that she had led with Obie Marsh. The passing years brought little change in the outward appearance of Lucinda Marsh. Gaunt, hard-featured, tight-lipped, and unemotional, she moved about the farm as of yore, doing a man's work in the field, adding to the dollars that were already in the bank, conducting her business along the lines to which she had been trained. She had never had friends. Obie Marsh had seen to that. She made none now. Her children grew to manhood and womanhood. Little Mary married and moved to the adjoining township. Lucinda made no complaint and no comment. Jimmy took the place of the hired man, lifting a bit of the burden of labor from his mother's shoulders. But she still held the reins of management. Then he too married and brought his own wife to the big gloomy old house at the end of the lane. Children came, 6 in quick succession. If their happy laughter wrought any change in the heart of the grim, silent old woman, she never showed it. Emma, Jimmy's wife, busy rearing her brood, was content to remain in the background. Lucinda Marsh was still mistress of the house. Through all the years, that one room just off the parlor, "Father's room" they called it, remained closed, the key hidden away in Lucinda's bureau drawer. It was never mentioned in the family circle. The children knew that there was something, some horrible taboo, that kept it from being talked about. Their childish imaginations did the rest. They passed it with bated breath. When darkness fell and shadows hovered outside the circle made by the big kerosene lamp on the center table, there was played on the other side of the room, casting furtive glances towards the dark panels, behind which lurked they knew not what. Then with the passing of the years came the hard times. First the grasshoppers destroyed the crops. Then came the drought. Prices went up, wages dropped, factories closed. Mary was the first to feel the blow. The bank foreclosed on her husband's farm. Then came illness and another baby. Finally she was forced to come home with her sick husband and her little brood. Lucinda Marsh, as unemotional as ever, made room for them. Jimmy's wife's brother lost his place in the city. Destitute, he appealed to his sister. She told her troubles to Lucinda Marsh. "4 more won't make no difference at the table," the old woman said grimly. "Write and tell 'em we'll make room for 'em somehow. Goodness knows, though, where we'll sleep 'em." They were sitting at the supper table when this conversation took place. It was Mary who, with a quick glance at her brother, ventured to speak that which was in all of their minds. "Father's room," she said timidly. "Couldn't we open that up and air it before they come, and let 'em sleep in there?" For a moment there was an odd silence. Lucinda Marsh turned her sunken eyes on her daughter, then glanced at the faces of the others. "I vowed that I'd never set foot in that room till my dying day," she said finally. "But they wouldn't be you, Mother," Mary argued, "and we're cramped for room right now. Where else can we sleep 'em?" Lucinda Marsh quietly laid down her knife and fork, her thin lips set in a straight, grim line. "If anybody sleeps in that room, 'twill be me," she said finally. "I lived with your father for 15 years, hating him every day more and more, and he hated me worse than I hated him, if such a thing is possible. The room's filled with our hatred. It's locked up in there, smoldering and ready to be fanned into flame again. But, Mother—" Lucinda Marsh straightened her bent old shoulders with a gesture of finality. "I'll move into it," she said grimly. "I wish that I hadn't mentioned it," Mary said regretfully. "I knew that there was some sort of sentiment attached to it, but—" The old woman cut her off. "Sentiment? Hate, you mean," she snapped. "But maybe it's for the best. I'm an old woman, way past 70. I'm about due to die anyway." She stopped, her aged eyes taking on a faraway look. Maybe it's for Dane, she said, half to herself. He said that he'd be waiting for me. Maybe he is. Who knows? She rose from the table and took a step toward the door. I'll open it up in the morning and let it air out, she said. She moved up the stairway to the upper floor, her lips straight and tight. For a long time Lucinda Marsh sat in a straight-backed chair beside her bed, her weary eyes gazing into vacancy, while the panorama of the years unfolded itself. To her had come a great urge, a desire which she had kept in leash for close to half a century, the longing that comes to all murderers, a yearning to visit the scene of her crime. 1,000 times before, the same desire had swept over her, and she had always fought it off. Now, however, with the fulfillment of her wish only a few hours away, there had come to her a seeming need for haste. The closed room was calling to her. Within her brain a voice was shrieking, "Now! Now!" To her aged mind it was the voice of the man she hated, the man she had killed. Getting up, she went to the bureau and, opening the drawer, found the key where she had hidden it so many years before. She held it in her gnarled fingers, fondling it, crooning over it. Her room was at the head of the stairs. One by one she heard the members of the household go to their rooms. Finally, the gloomy old house was filled with an indescribable quietness. Rising, she opened the door a tiny crack and peered out into the dark hallway. Satisfied that all were asleep, she picked up the small hand lamp and tiptoed furtively down the creaking stairs. A storm was in the air. She could hear the wind rising and shrieking through the branches of the streets. There was something reminiscent about the mournful wail. She stopped a moment, her head bent forward. Then remembrance swept over her. "'Twas like this the night before he died," she muttered to herself. Her heart was beating a trifle faster as she reached the dark, grim door. She hesitated an instant, then transferring the lamp to her left hand, she inserted the key in the lock. She turned hard, as if reluctant to reveal the mysteries it hid. Then the tumbler shot back. For a moment she waited, her fingers on the knob. She was trembling now, shaking, with an emotion she did not understand. "He said that he'd be waiting for me," she murmured. "I wonder if he is." She turned the knob and pushed against the panel. The aged hinges squeaked protestingly. Then the door swung open. A wave of malignancy and hatred surged over her. She stepped inside, her lips closed in a tight, grim line. Just inside the door she waited, the lamp held high above her, her head, her eyes taking in every detail. There was the bed unmade where he had died. The thought came to her that Bill Reynolds, the undertaker, the last person to set foot in the room, was gone too. At the head of the bed was the little stand. On top of it was the glass in which she had administered the poison. Beside it was a bottle of medicine half empty. The label, covered with old Doc Plummer's crabbed hieroglyphics, was yellow and faded. Doc Plummer. He too had been festering in his grave for years. There was the pillow where Obie's head had rested when he died. One corner was twisted where he had held it when the last spasm of agony had knifed its way through his vitals. Nothing was changed. "He said that he'd be waiting for me," she said again. The room was musty and mildewed, the dust of years over everything. She closed the door and set the lamp upon the little stand. Going to the window, she pushed it up to its full length. The wind swept in, howling and shrieking. The lamp sputtered, causing queer, grotesque shadows to dance in the distant corners. Across the back of the chair, where she had thrown it years before, was the yellowed sheet with which she had smothered the dying breath out of her husband. There was a darker spot upon its mildewed surface. She knew it for the spittle that had drooled from his mouth. She moved to the center of the room, still peering furtively into the shadows. "He said that he'd come back from the grave and be waiting for me," she said again and again. A fresh gust of wind howled through the window. The lamp sputtered, smoke flared up, then went out. Out of the darkness came a thing, a shapeless thing of white. For a moment it hung suspended in midair. It hovered over her, its long, shapeless arms reaching out for her. The wind shrieked with merry gusto. "Said he be waitin'," she murmured. It swept over her, holding her in its folds, twisting about her, smothering her. "God!" she shrieked, clawing at the enveloping tentacles. "He kept his word. He was waiting." In the morning they found her. Twisted about her head and throat was a yellowed sheet, the sheet with which she had smothered her husband. The Coat by A.E.D. Smith. I'm quite aware that the other fellows in the office regard me as something of an oddity, as being rather a queer bird, in fact. Well, of course, a man who happens to be of a studious disposition, who dislikes noise and prefers his own company to that of empty-headed companions, and who moreover is compelled by defective vision to wear thick glasses, is always liable to be thus misjudged by inferior minds. And ordinarily I treat the opinion of my colleagues with the contempt it deserves. But at this particular moment I was beginning to think that perhaps after all there might be something to be said for their view. For though I might still repudiate the queer bird part of the business, undoubtedly I was an ass, a first-class chump. Otherwise I should have been spending my holidays in a nice comfortable way with the rest of the normal world, listening to the Pierrots or winking at the girls on the promenade of some seaside resort at home, instead of having elected to set out alone on this idiotic push-bike tour of a little-known part of France, drenched, hungry, and lost, a stranger in a strange land, dispiritedly pushing before me a heavily laden bicycle with a gashed tire. Such was the present result of my asinine choice. The storm had overtaken me miles from anywhere, on a wild road over a spur of the Vosges, and for nearly 2 hours I had trudged through the pelting rain without encountering a living soul at the least sign of human habitation. And then, at long last, rounding a bend, I glimpsed just ahead of me the chimney pots and gables of a fair-sized house. It was a lonely, desolate-looking place, standing amid a clump of trees a little way back from the road, and somehow, even at a distance, did not convey a very inviting impression. Nevertheless, in that wilderness it was a welcome enough sight, and in the hope of finding temporary shelter, and possibly a little badly needed refreshment, I quickened my pace towards it. 200 yards brought me to the entrance gates, and here I suffered a grievous disappointment, for the roofless porter's lodge, the dilapidated old gates hanging askew on their hinges, and the overgrown drive beyond, plainly indicated that the place was no longer inhabited. I speedily comforted myself, however, with the reflection that in the circumstances even a deserted house was not to be despised as a refuge. Once under cover of some kind, I might make shift to wring out my drenched clothing and repair my damaged mount, and without further ado I pushed my bicycle up the long-neglected drive and reached the terrace in front of the house itself. It proved to be an old chateau, half smothered in creepers and vines that had long gone wild, and judging by the carved stone coat of arms over the main entrance, had once been occupied by a person of some quality. Mounted on a pedestal on either side of the iron-studded front door stood a rusty carronade, trophies probably of some long-forgotten war in which the former occupier had played a part. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was evident that the place had stood empty for many years. I tried the front door. To my surprise it was unfastened, and a thrust of my shoulder sent it creaking grudgingly back on its hinges. My nostrils, as I stepped into the dim, wide hall, were at once assailed by the stale, disagreeable odor of rotting woodwork and mouldy hangings and carpets. For a moment or two I stood peering uncertainly about me, with a slight feeling of eeriness that one usually experiences when entering an old, empty house. Facing me was a broad staircase with a long stained-glass window, almost opaque with dirt and cobwebs at its head. I mounted the stairs, and throwing open the first door at hand, found myself looking into a spacious, handsomely furnished room that had evidently once been the chief apartment of the house, though long neglect and disuse had now reduced it to a sorry state. The ornate cornice hung there in strips, and in one corner the plaster of the ceilings had come down altogether. Green mold covered the 18th century furniture, curtains, and draperies hung in tatters, and one half of the beautiful old Persian carpet from a point near the door right across to the fireplace was overspread by an evil-smelling bright orange fungus. The fireplace gave me an idea. Could I but find fuel I might light a fire, make myself a hot drink, and get my clothes properly dried. A little searching in the outbuildings discovered a sufficient quantity of old sticks to serve my purpose, and with a bundle of them under my coat, I re-entered the house and briskly made my way upstairs again. But on the threshold of the big room, without quite knowing why, I suddenly checked. It was as though my legs, of their own volition, had all at once become reluctant to carry me further into the apartment, as if something quite outside of me were urging me to turn about and retreat. I laid the sticks down at my feet, and for a moment or two stood there, uncertain in the doorway. I was beginning to sense some subtle suggestion of danger in the atmosphere of the place. Everything was apparently just as I had left it, yet I had an uneasy sort of feeling that during my brief absence something evil had entered that room and left it again. I am neither a nervous nor a superstitious person, yet I found myself a moment later, rather shamefacedly, picking up my sticks and moving back towards the head of the stairs. Actually, it was not so much fear as a vague precautionary sense of uneasiness that prompted me. It had occurred to me that perhaps I might feel more comfortable if I remained nearer to the front door, and made my fire in one of the rooms on the ground floor. If it was an idiotic fancy, I know, but, well, if anything queer did happen and I had to make a sudden bolt for it, I could get out quicker that way. It was on the second descent of the stairs, as I faced the light from the open front door, that I suddenly noticed something that pulled me up with a decided start. Running up the center of the staircase, and quite fresh in the thick dust, was a broad broken sort of track, exactly as though someone had recently trailed up an empty sack or something of that nature. From the foot of the staircase I traced this track across the hall to a spot immediately below an old moth-eaten coat that hung from one of a row of coat pegs on the opposite wall, and then I saw that similar tracks traversed the hall in various directions, some terminating before the door on either side, others leading past the foot of the stairs to the rear regions of the house, but all seeming to radiate from the same point below the coat pegs. And the queerest thing about it all was that of footprints, other than my own, there was not a sign. Uneasiness once more assailed me. The house appeared to be uninhabited, and yet plainly someone or something had recently been in the place. Who or what was the restless questing creature that had made those strange tracks to and from the old coat? Was it some half-witted vagrant? A woman, possibly, whose trailing draperies obliterated her own footprints? I had a closer look at the old garment. It was a military greatcoat of ancient pattern, with one or two tarnished silver buttons still attached to it, and had evidently seen much service. Turning it round on its peg with a gingerly finger and thumb, I discovered that just below the left shoulder there was a round hole as big as a penny, surrounded by an area of scorched and stained earth, as though a heavy pistol had been fired into it at point-blank range. If a pistol bullet had indeed made that hole, then obviously the old coat, at one period of its existence, had clothed a dead man. A sudden repugnance for the thing overcame me, and with a slight shudder I let go of it. It may have been fancy or not, but all at once it seemed to me there was more than an odor of mold and rotting cloth emanating from the thing, that there was a taint of putrefying flesh and bone, a taint of animal corruption, faint but unmistakable. I could sniff it in the air, and with it something less definable but no less real, a sort of sixth sense feeling that the whole atmosphere of the place was slowly becoming charged with evil emanations from a black and shameful past. With an effort I pulled myself together. After all, what was there to be scared about? I had no need to fear human marauders, for in my hip pocket I carried a small but serviceable automatic, and as for ghosts, well, if such existed, they didn't usually walk in the daytime. The place certainly felt creepy, and I shouldn't have cared to spend the night there, but it would be ridiculous to allow mere idle fancies to drive me out again into that beastly rain before I'd made myself that badly needed hot drink and mended my bicycle. I therefore opened the door nearest to me and entered a smallish room that apparently had once been used as a study. The fireplace was on the side opposite to the door, and the wide ancient grate was still choked with the ashes of the last log consumed there. I picked up the poker, a cumbersome old thing with a knob as big as an orange, raked out the ashes, and laid my sticks in approved Boy Scout fashion. But the wood was damp, and after I had used up half my matches refused to do more than smolder, while a back draught from the chimney filled the room with smoke. In desperation I went down on my hands and knees and tried to rouse the embers into flame by blowing on them, and in the middle of this irksome operation I was startled by a sound of movement in the hall, a single soft flop, as though someone had flung down a garment. I was on my feet in a flash, listening with every nerve taut. No further sound came, and automatic in hand I tiptoed to the door. There was nothing in the hall, nothing to be heard at all save that steady swish of the rain outside, but from a spot on the floor directly below the old coat, the dust was rising in a little eddying cloud, as though it had just been disturbed. A rat, I told myself, and went back to my task. More vigorous blowing on the embers, more raking and poking, more striking of matches, and in the midst of it again came that curious noise, not very loud, but plain and unmistakable. Once more I went into the hall, and once more, except for another little cloud of dust rising from precisely the same spot as before, there was nothing to be seen. But that sixth sense warning of imminent danger was becoming more insistent. I had the feeling now that I was no longer alone in the old empty hall, that some unclean, invisible presence was lurking there, tainting the very air with its foulness. It's no use, I said to myself. I may be a nervous fool, but I can't stand any more of this. I'll collect my traps and clear out while the going's good. With this, I went back into the room, and keeping a nervous eye cocked on the door, began with rather panicky haste to repack my haversack. And just as I was in the act of tightening the last strap, there came from the hall a low, evil chuckle, followed by the sound of stealthy movement. I whipped out my weapon and stood where I was in the middle of the floor, facing the door with my blood turning to ice. Through the chink between the door hinges, I saw a shadow pass. Then the door creaked a little, slowly beginning to open, and round it there came the coat. It stood there upright in the doorway as God is above me, swaying a little as though uncertain of its balance, collar and shoulders extended as though by an invisible wearer, the old musty coat I had seen hanging in the hall. For a space that seemed an eternity, I stood like a man of stone, facing the thing as it seemed to pause on the threshold. A dreadful sort of hypnotism held me rooted to the spot on which I stood, a hypnotism that completely paralyzed my body and caused the pistol to slip from my nerveless fingers, and yet left my brain clear. Mingled with my frozen terror was a feeling of deadly nausea. I knew that I was in the presence of ultimate evil, that the very aura of the hell-engendered thing reared there in the doorway was contamination, that its actual touch would mean not only the instant destruction of my body, but the everlasting damnation of my soul. And now it was coming into the room, with an indescribable bobbing sort of motion, the empty sleeves jerking grotesquely at its side, the skirts flopping and trailing in the dust, was slowly coming towards me, and step by step, with my bulging eyes riveted in awful fascination on the thing, I was recoiling before it, step by step, with the rigid, unconscious movement of an automaton. I drew back until I was brought up with my back pressed into the fireplace and could retreat no further, and still with deadly malevolent purpose the thing crept towards me. The empty sleeves were rising and shakily reaching out towards my throat. In another moment they would touch me, and then I knew with the most dreadful certainty that my reason would snap. A coherent thought somehow came into my burning brain, something that I had read or heard of long ago, the power of the holy sign against the forces of evil. With a last desperate effort, a will, I stretched out a palsied finger and made the sign of the cross. And in that instant my other hand, scrabbling frenziedly at the wall behind me, came into contact with something cold and hard and brown. It was the knob of the old heavy poker. The touch of the cold iron seemed to give me instant repossession of my faculties. With lightning swiftness I swung up the heavy poker and struck with all my force at the nightmare horror before me. And lo, on the instant the thing collapsed and became an old coat, nothing more, lying there in a heap at my feet. Yet on my oath, as I cleared the hellish thing in a flying leap and fled from the room, I saw it, out of the tail of my eye, gathering itself together and making shape, as it were, to scramble after me. Once outside that accursed house, I ran as never man ran before, and I remember nothing more until I found myself half fainting before the door of a little inn. "Bring wine, in the name of God," I cried, staggering inside. Wine was brought, and a little wondering group stood round me while I drank. I tried to explain to them in my bad French. They continued to regard me with puzzled looks. At length a look of understanding came into the landlord's face. "Mon Dieu," he gasped. "Is it possible that monsieur has been in that place? Quick, Juliet, monsieur will need another bottle of wine." Later, I got something of the story from the landlord, though he was by no means eager to tell it. The deserted house had once been occupied by a retired officer of the First Napoleon's army, a semi-madman with a strain of weird blood in him. Judging from the landlord's story, he must have been one of the worst men that God ever allowed to walk the earth. "Most certainly, monsieur, he was a bad man, that one," concluded my host. "He killed his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay hands on, even, it is said, his own daughters. In the end, one of them shot him in the back. The old chateau has an evil name. If you offered 1,000,000 francs, you would not get one of our country folks to go near the place." As I said at the beginning, I know that there's fellows in the office are inclined, as it is, to regard me as being a bit queer, so I haven't told any of them this story. Nevertheless, it's perfectly true. My brand new bicycle and touring traps are probably still lying where I left them in the hall of that devil-ridden chateau. Anybody who cares to collect them may keep them.